The morning of June 11th, 1944, a ridge overlooking the village of Villers-Bocage in Normandy, France. British tank commander Lieutenant William Cotton pressed his eye to the periscope of his Cromwell tank, scanning the Bocage country that stretched before him like a green maze. His squadron, part of the 7th Armoured Division, the famed Desert Rats, had pushed deep into German-held territory. Perhaps too deep. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Cotton had fought across North Africa. He'd seen what German 88mm guns could do to Allied armour at El Alamein. He'd watched Shermans brew up the tankers' grim euphemism for catastrophic fuel fires when Panzer IVs caught them at long range in the Tunisian hills. He understood the mathematics of armoured warfare intimately. The tank with the better gun, positioned on higher ground, firing from concealment, almost always won. What Cotton didn't know yet, what none of the British tankers advancing through Normandy's hedgerow country understood, was that the Germans had systematically inverted every principle of defensive tank warfare that Allied doctrine assumed. They had developed a technique so counterintuitive, so apparently suicidal, that it would take weeks of brutal combat before British and American crews fully grasped what they were facing. The technique was called reverse slope defense, and on this June morning, it was about to demonstrate why German armoured forces, though heavily outnumbered, would exact such a terrible price from Allied tank units throughout the Normandy campaign. The concept of holding high ground had dominated military thinking for millennia. Ancient Greek hoplites seized hilltops, Roman legions fortified ridgelines, Napoleon positioned artillery on commanding terrain. The logic was self-evident. Height provided visibility, extended weapon range, and forced enemies to attack uphill while defenders fired downward. Every military academy from Sandhurst to West Point taught that dominating terrain meant occupying the highest ground available. Tank warfare in 1944 followed this doctrine religiously. Allied tactical manuals specified that armoured units should seize elevated positions that maximised observation and fields of fire. American tank destroyer doctrine, built around the M10 Wolverine and M18 Hellcat, emphasised positioning these vehicles on hilltops where their high-velocity guns could engage German armour at maximum range. British armoured doctrine similarly stressed the importance of hull-down positions on forward slopes, where tanks could observe the battlefield while exposing only their turrets. This thinking reflected combat experience from North Africa, where vast open spaces and relatively flat terrain made long-range gunnery duels the norm. At Gazala, at Kasserine, Pass, at dozens of desert engagements, the side that spotted the enemy first and engaged at longer range typically prevailed. Tank commanders who seized the high ground, who positioned their vehicles where German gun optics could see farthest, gained decisive advantages. Those lessons, learned in sand and heat, became doctrinal certainty. But Normandy's Bocage country bore no resemblance to North African deserts. The hedgerows, ancient earthen banks topped with dense vegetation that divided French farmland into small, irregular fields, created a fundamentally different battlefield. Visibility was measured in hundreds of yards, not thousands. Observation from hilltops revealed only more hedgerows, endless green walls that concealed everything. The Germans recognized this terrain's defensive potential immediately. General Feldmarschall Erwin Rommel, assigned to strengthen the Atlantic Wall defenses in late 1943, understood that Germany could not match Allied material superiority. By June 1944, the Allies had concentrated approximately 11,000 aircraft, 7,000 naval vessels, and over 150,000 troops for the Normandy invasion. German forces in France comprised approximately 50 divisions, many under strength and poorly equipped. Rommel could not win through numerical superiority or industrial production. He needed tactical innovations that multiplied the effectiveness of limited resources. Rommel had witnessed the devastation of Allied air power in North Africa. He'd watched Stuka dive bombers and Messerschmitt fighters, once dominant, swept from North African skies by increasing numbers of Spitfires, Hurricanes, and American Thunderbolts. He'd experienced what Allied commanders called cab rank air support, where fighter bombers circled overhead, waiting for ground controllers to direct them against German positions. Any German tank that revealed its position on open terrain could expect rocket and cannon fire from Allied aircraft within minutes. The reverse slope technique emerged from this tactical reality. Instead of positioning tanks on forward slopes or hilltops where they could see and be seen, German doctrine placed armor behind ridgelines, completely hidden from enemy observation. These positions sacrificed the traditional advantages of high ground. Commanders couldn't observe enemy movements, gunners couldn't engage targets at long range. The tanks were essentially blind, dependent on forward observers to report enemy locations. But this apparent disadvantage created asymmetric benefits that transformed defensive warfare. Tanks positioned on reverse slopes were invisible to enemy forces until those forces crested the ridge, at which point German tanks engaged at point-blank range, typically less than 400 yards. At such close distances, even the lighter German Panzer IV's 75mm gun could penetrate Allied tank armor. The technical advantages of heavier Allied tanks, thicker armor, and more powerful guns meant far less when combat occurred at ranges where any weapon could achieve lethal penetration. Retry T. Part 2. Part 2. The collision with reality. The tactical mechanics of reverse slope defense required meticulous preparation and iron discipline. German tank commanders couldn't simply park their vehicles behind any convenient hill. The technique demanded careful reconnaissance, precise positioning, and coordination with infantry and anti-tank units that would provide the eyes the hidden tanks lacked. A proper reverse slope position began with terrain analysis. German reconnaissance teams identified ridgelines that provided concealment while allowing rapid movement to firing positions. The ideal reverse slope offered a gradual approach from the rear, allowing tanks to advance to the crest without exposing their vulnerable hull or tracks. The forward slope needed to be steep enough that Allied tanks would be silhouetted against the sky as they crested, making them perfect targets. The Germans positioned their tanks approximately 50 to 100 yards behind the military crest, the point where ground begins sloping downward on the reverse side. This distance provided concealment from direct observation while allowing tanks to reach firing positions within seconds once enemy movement was detected. Crews pre-positioned aiming stakes, physical markers that indicated precise points where their guns should be aimed to engage specific sectors of the forward slope. Forward observers, typically infantry teams equipped with binoculars and radio equipment, positioned themselves in concealed locations on the forward slope or in the valley below. These observers reported enemy movements, estimated ranges, and directed the hidden tanks to their firing positions. The system required absolute radio discipline and clear communication protocols. A single transmission error could mean German tanks advancing into Allied fire instead of achieving surprise. The psychological burden on German tank crews was immense. Sitting behind a ridge, while observers reported enemy tanks approaching, created a helplessness that contradicted every aggressive instinct. Crews heard engine noise growing louder, knew Allied armor was closing the distance, but could see nothing. The temptation to advance to the crest prematurely, to seize the initiative, to do something rather than wait passively, had to be suppressed through training and discipline. SS Obersturmbannführer Michael Wittmann, commander of the 2nd Company, 101st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion, had mastered reverse slope tactics on the Eastern Front. By June 1944, Wittmann had been credited with destroying 138 enemy tanks and 132 anti-tank guns, making him Germany's most successful tank ace. His tactics emphasized patience, concealment, and striking from unexpected angles. Wittmann's Tiger I tank, chassis number 250, weighed 57 tons and mounted the feared 88mm Kepler K-36 gun. This weapon could penetrate 4 inches of armor at 2,000 yards range, making it superior to virtually every Allied tank gun deployed in Normandy. But Wittmann understood that technical superiority meant nothing. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. If Allied air power caught his Tiger in the open, the reverse slope technique allowed him to leverage the Tiger's firepower while minimizing exposure to the Typhoon fighter bombers that dominated Normandy's skies. On June 13, 1944, Wittmann's company occupied reverse slope positions near Villers-Bocage, a small market town that controlled a critical road junction. British forces from the 7th Armoured Division had advanced rapidly following the D-Day landings, creating a salient that threatened to outflank German defensive lines. The British advance had been so swift that supporting infantry hadn't kept pace, leaving armoured units dangerously exposed. The 4th County of London Yeomanry, equipped with Cromwell tanks, led the British advance through Villers-Bocage on the morning of June 13th. The Cromwell was a capable medium tank by British standards, mounting a 75mm gun and capable of 30 miles per hour on roads. Its armour, however, was thin by 1944 standards. Frontal hull armour measured only 2.5 inches, sloped at minimal angles. Any German tank gun or anti-tank weapon could penetrate a Cromwell at typical combat ranges. The British column advanced through Villers-Bocage's narrow streets in single file, standard procedure in constricted urban terrain. Behind the Cromwells followed Sherman Fireflies, up-gunned Sherman variants mounting British 17-pounder guns, half-tracks carrying infantry, and soft-skinned supply vehicles. The column stretched over half a mile, moving at cautious speed through the town and onto the road, designated Point 213, that led northeast toward high ground. Wittmann, observing from concealed positions outside the town, recognized the tactical situation immediately. The British column was strung out, vulnerable, advancing without proper reconnaissance. His Tiger and 4 others from his company occupied reverse slope positions covering the approaches to Villers-Bocage. The British advance would bring them directly into the killing zone. The ambush began at approximately 0800 hours. The lead British tanks, advancing along Route 213, crested a low ridge northeast of Villers-Bocage. At that instant, Wittmann's Tiger advanced to its firing position, appearing from behind the reverse slope with its 88mm gun already traversed toward the enemy. The first shot struck a Cromwell at approximately 200 yards range. The 88mm armour-piercing round, travelling at 2,600 feet per second, punched through the Cromwell's frontal armour as if it were cardboard. The penetrator continued through the crew compartment, struck the ammunition stowage, and detonated, stored 75mm rounds. The internal explosion blew the turret completely off the hull, killing all 5 crew members instantly. Before the British could react, Wittmann's gunner had chambered a second round and acquired the next target. Another Cromwell, attempting to reverse away from the ambush, presented its vulnerable side armour. The second shot penetrated at an oblique angle, the armour-piercing round passing through the engine compartment and into the fighting compartment. Fuel and hydraulic fluid ignited. The crew bailed out, several men with severe burns. The tactical geometry of the ambush was devastating. British tanks on the forward slope were silhouetted against the sky, perfectly visible to German gunners. Wittmann's Tiger, positioned on the reverse slope, appeared only as a dark shape against vegetation, difficult to identify and harder to target. The range was too close for British gunners to miss, but it was also too close for them to survive long enough to fire accurately. British tank commanders attempted standard counter-ambush tactics. Several Cromwells advanced toward the German position, hoping to close range where their guns might penetrate Tiger armour. But reverse slope positioning meant they couldn't see Wittmann's tank until they crested the ridge, at which point they were already in his gun sights. The Tigers, positioned to cover multiple approach routes, engaged each British tank as it appeared. Within 10 minutes, Wittmann's company had destroyed 7 Cromwell tanks and damaged 3 others. British crews who survived the initial ambush reported the psychological shock of facing an enemy they couldn't see until it was too late. One commander described advancing toward engine noises and muzzle flashes, reaching what he thought was effective firing range, only to crest a small rise and find a Tiger tank 75 yards away with its gun already aimed at his position. But Wittmann wasn't finished. Recognizing that the British column remained vulnerable, he manoeuvred his Tiger into Villers-Bocage itself, advancing through the narrow streets where the remainder of the British force sat stationary. The town's confined spaces should have favored defenders. Infantry with anti-tank weapons, positioned in buildings, typically dominated urban armor battles. But the British infantry hadn't dismounted yet. They sat in their half-tracks, waiting for the armoured vanguard to secure the area. Wittmann's Tiger entered Villers-Bocage from the northeast, advancing down the main street designated Rue Clemenceau. The British column, strung out along the road, presented perfect targets. The Tiger's 88mm gun, capable of penetrating any Allied tank frontally, was equally effective against lightly armoured vehicles and half-tracks at point-blank range. The Tiger destroyed 4 Sherman Fireflies in rapid succession. These upgunned Shermans, mounting 17-pounder guns capable of threatening even Tiger armour, represented the most dangerous British tanks in Normandy. Wittmann's gunner, SS Unterscharführer Balthasar Voll, engaged each Firefly with single shots, achieving penetrations that detonated ammunition and killed crews before British gunners could traverse their weapons. The psychological effect was catastrophic. British crews watching from further back in the column saw a single German tank systematically destroying their unit. Some crews bailed out immediately, abandoning functional tanks to escape on foot. Others attempted to reverse away from the Tiger, only to collide with vehicles behind them or become immobilized in Villers-Bocage's narrow streets. Wittmann continued his rampage through Villers-Bocage, destroying 3 Cromwell tanks, 4 Sherman Fireflies, 3 Stuart light tanks, and 15 half-tracks, unarmoured vehicles. The engagement lasted approximately 15 minutes. When British infantry finally dismounted and began engaging with anti-tank weapons, Wittmann withdrew, his Tiger having expended most of its ammunition but suffering no significant damage. The butcher's bill from Villers-Bocage shocked British commanders. The 4th County of London Yeomanry effectively ceased to exist as a fighting unit. 27 tanks destroyed or abandoned, 14 half-tracks and support vehicles lost, over 200 casualties killed, wounded, or captured. The 7th Armoured Division's advance, which had threatened to create a decisive breakthrough, ground to a halt. German losses were minimal. Wittmann's Tiger sustained minor damage from a British 6-pounder anti-tank gun, scratches on the frontal armour that didn't affect combat capability. No German crew members were killed. The other Tigers from Wittmann's company reported similar results. Multiple British tanks destroyed, minimal return fire, no losses. The Villers-Bocage engagement became a case study in how reverse slope tactics multiplied the effectiveness of inferior numbers. 5 German Tigers, properly positioned and expertly handled, had defeated a British armoured battalion supported by infantry. The technical advantages of the Tiger, its armour and gun, mattered less than the tactical advantage of positioning. British tanks never engaged from ranges where their guns might penetrate German armour. They died at point-blank distance, ambushed by an enemy they couldn't see until too late. Allied intelligence officers studying the Villers-Bocage disaster initially attributed German success to Tiger superiority. Reports circulated describing the Tiger as nearly invincible, emphasizing its thick armour and powerful gun. This assessment missed the crucial tactical innovation. The Tiger's technical specifications hadn't changed. What changed was how German commanders employed those specifications within terrain that negated Allied advantages. The reverse slope technique spread throughout German armoured units in Normandy. Panzer Lehr Division, 1st SS Panzer Division, 2nd Panzer Division, all adopted variations of the tactic. After-action reports from German commanders emphasized positioning over firepower. A well-positioned Panzer IV on a reverse slope was described as more effective than a Tiger on a forward slope exposed to air attack. The technique's effectiveness appeared in casualty statistics. In July 1944, British Second Army reported losing approximately 4 tanks for every German tank destroyed. This exchange rate was unsustainable. British tank production, though substantial, couldn't replace losses at that rate while simultaneously supplying replacement crews trained to adequate standards. The 7th Armoured Division alone lost over 300 tanks during the first 6 weeks of the Normandy campaign, many to reverse slope ambushes. American forces encountered the same tactics when they pushed south from Omaha and Utah beaches. The Battle of Saint-Lô in July 1944 demonstrated how reverse slope positioning neutralized American advantages in artillery and air support. German Panther and Panzer IV tanks occupied positions behind ridgelines surrounding the town. American tanks, advancing across open ground, couldn't identify German positions until they crested defensive ridges. The 2nd Armored Division's combat reports from Saint-Lô described engagements where American Shermans advanced toward suspected German positions, reached what appeared to be commanding terrain, only to find themselves targeted from unseen positions at ranges under 300 yards. At such close distances, the Sherman's 3-inch frontal armor provided minimal protection against German 75mm and 88mm guns. American tank destroyers, designed to engage from long range using speed and firepower rather than armor, were particularly vulnerable. The M10 Wolverine's open-topped turret and thin armor made it deadly against German tanks at distances exceeding 1,000 yards. But reverse slope tactics negated that range advantage. M10 crews reported advancing to firing positions, acquiring target areas through binoculars, only to be engaged from unexpected angles at point-blank range by German tanks they never saw. The psychological impact on Allied crews was severe. Tankers began approaching every ridgeline with dread, knowing that cresting the high ground might reveal a German gun already aimed at their position. The aggressive tactics that had worked in North Africa, pushing forward to dominate terrain, became suicidal in Normandy's close terrain. Crews developed a fatalistic gallows humor, referring to ridgelines as meat grinders, and joking that the safest place in Normandy was anywhere except the front of an Allied tank column. But the Allied response to reverse slope tactics demonstrated adaptability that ultimately overcame German tactical innovations. Artillery forward observers began calling in indirect fire on reverse slopes where German tanks couldn't be seen, but logic suggested they must be positioned. Allied fighter bombers shifted tactics, attacking suspected reverse slope positions with rockets and bombs even when tanks weren't visible. Most effectively, Allied infantry began coordinating more closely with armor. Infantry squads advanced ahead of tanks, clearing hedgerows and ridgelines, identifying German positions before armor committed to the advance. This infantry-armor integration, initially poor in early Normandy fighting, improved dramatically as combat experience accumulated. The Canadian 3rd Infantry Division developed particularly effective counter-tactics during the Battle for Caen in July and August 1944. Canadian infantry, supported by artillery observers and mortar teams, would advance to ridgelines under covering fire. Once the crest was secured, Canadian tank units moved forward, engaging German reverse slope positions from angles the Germans hadn't anticipated. This methodical approach sacrificed speed for security, but reduced tank losses dramatically. British forces adapted similarly after catastrophic early losses. The Guards Armoured Division implemented protocols requiring infantry reconnaissance before any armoured advance over unfamiliar terrain. British artillery doctrine evolved to include predicted fire missions, pre-planned bombardments of likely reverse slope positions timed to suppress German tanks during Allied advances. American forces, with their emphasis on material superiority and firepower, developed the most resource-intensive counter to reverse slope tactics. When facing suspected German positions behind ridgelines, American commanders called in massive artillery preparations, sometimes expending thousands of shells on areas where German tanks might be located. This profligate use of ammunition, economically unsustainable for Germany, was routine for American forces, supplied by the world's largest industrial economy. The ultimate limitation of reverse slope defense emerged from its inherent passivity. German tanks positioned behind ridgelines could ambush Allied advances, but they couldn't retake lost ground. Each successful defense bought time but didn't change strategic reality. The Allies, with their overwhelming superiority in men, material, and logistics, could afford losses that would cripple German forces. Germany couldn't. By August 1944, the Normandy campaign's outcome was inevitable despite German tactical excellence. Operation Cobra, the American breakout from the Saint-Lô area, succeeded not by defeating German reverse slope positions directly, but by bypassing them, exploiting gaps created by Allied numerical superiority. German units that had executed perfect reverse-slope defences found themselves surrounded and cut off, forced to abandon positions and vehicles when Allied advances threatened encirclement. The Falaise Pocket, where German 7th Army attempted to withdraw through an Allied encirclement in August 1944, marked the end of effective German armoured resistance in Normandy. Reverse slope tactics meant nothing when there were no defensible ridgelines, when Allied forces attacked from multiple directions simultaneously, when Typhoon fighter bombers hunted German armour with impunity. Michael Wittmann, the Tiger ace whose Villers-Bocage ambush had demonstrated reverse slope effectiveness, died on August 8, 1944, near Saint-Aignan-de-Cramesnil. His Tiger, advancing to support German defensive positions, was engaged by multiple Sherman Fireflies from a British armoured unit. The exact circumstances remain disputed. Some accounts credit Canadian Sherman Firefly commander Joe Eakins with destroying Wittmann's Tiger. Others suggest rocket-firing Typhoon fighter bombers delivered the killing blow. What's certain is that Wittmann died when his tactical situation prevented using the reverse slope techniques that had made him so effective. Caught in the open, engaged from multiple angles, his Tiger's technical advantages couldn't compensate for being outnumbered and outmaneuvered. The tank that had destroyed over 100 Allied vehicles burned like any other when penetrated by a 17-pounder round. The legacy of reverse slope defense extended far beyond World War II. The technique became standard doctrine in every modern army. Israeli armor employed reverse slope tactics with devastating effectiveness during the Yom Kippur War in 1973, ambushing Syrian tanks advancing across the Golan Heights. American tank doctrine during the Cold War emphasized reverse slope positioning to counter numerically superior Soviet armor. The M1 Abrams tank, deployed in the 1980s, incorporated design features specifically intended to enhance reverse slope effectiveness. Its powerful gas turbine engine could accelerate the 60-ton vehicle from concealment to firing position in seconds. Its advanced fire control system allowed accurate first-round hits even during rapid movement. Its depleted uranium armor provided protection if forced to engage from exposed positions. Modern American tank doctrine still teaches the principles Wittmann and his contemporaries perfected in Normandy: concealment over visibility, surprise over firepower, positioning over technical specifications. These principles, born from desperation when Germany could no longer match Allied production, became timeless fundamentals of armoured warfare. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.